Hello, everybody. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you can hold your questions till the end, we'll do a Q&A. And at that time, you can throw them in the chat or unmute yourself, but just wait till we're finished. Tomorrow, I will email out a link to the recording of the webinar. So if you miss anything or if you'd like to share it, you can look for that tomorrow. And then if you haven't already, please go ahead and mute yourself. We have several people in the meeting today and background noise carries. So first off, this webinar is hosted by Backlog. Backlog is my company. We've been around for about 2 years, and we've been really helping smaller institutions bring their collections online. So setting up digitization processes, helping them set up digital archives, writing policies and procedures. So we've been able to help places that don't need a full-time archivist, but need a little bit of help, even if that helps just volunteer training. So we do archival consulting, which again is some policies and procedure writing, anything else that's needed. Platform hosting is things like setting up and doing volunteer training on Archivematica, Omeka, and Archive Space. And then we also do some genealogy research, so helping you break through any brick walls that you might have. Yeah, so I'm Emma. I founded Backlog 2 years ago. I was laid off at the beginning of the pandemic, and I found that a lot of places need a little bit of archives help, but not necessarily a full-time person. And that's where me and my team have been able to kind of fill a gap. And it's been a lot of fun seeing different places around the Midwest and their collections and being able to bring some of those collections online.
And I'm Jenna, so I'll be presenting today on finding aids. And I recently switched from higher education archives to museum archives. But in my previous position, I was a lone arranger. So I ran the archives completely on my own, doing the work of a zillion different people. So, and that included writing finding aids. So I am part of our state finding aid network, and I'm also one of the reps for my state for the National Finding Aid Network initiative, which I will talk about a little bit during this presentation.
And I'll let you take it from here.
All right, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about really 4 different things: defining a finding aid, and then I'm going to talk about 2 standards: DACS, which is Describing Archives, a Content Standard, EAD, which is Encoded Archival Description, and then alternatives and sort of questioning the idea of the finding aid, its necessity, and other ways of bringing your archives information to your users. Next slide, please. So my understanding is that finding aid used to be a much more generalized term. If you look at the archives literature from the earlier part of the 20th century, it was think of it as like a lowercase finding aid versus an uppercase finding aid. In the sort of deluge of information that happened after World War II, the conversations among the very newly formed Society of American Archivists began to speak more specifically about finding aids as a type of guide. They weren't a new concept, but they became more and more necessary to help researchers navigate larger and larger collections, particularly of government information. So SAA describes a finding aid as containing both structural information and contextual information about the archival material. So structural information is how is it arranged, what's the inventory. Contextual information would be information like a biography of the person whose papers they are. Finding aids are akin to catalog records for books, but with a lot of additional research and details about what's in the collection, because every finding aid is different. There are some aspects of archival collections that are common to all collections, but most of it is very different. So if you're cataloging in a very traditional, like a MARC record for an archival collection, there's a lot of information that you can capture in a standard way for books that you can't capture in the same way for archival collections. So finding aids really allow for much more detailed information to help a user navigate an amount of information that is probably much larger than a book. An archivist can write a finding aid for a huge collection, for a single item, or for each series or subgroup within a collection. It can describe many different groupings of archival materials. And I also think that finding aids are how archivists can really engage in and contribute to scholarly research and creating their finding aids and writing historical notes, providing contextual information, really putting out new information about the people, the organizations, and the events that are captured in those records. There are standards that we're going to discuss for finding, using, and formatting information about collections using DACS and EAD, as we'll get to. But a finding aid doesn't have to be scary as a technical document. Furthermore, there are other descriptive surrogates that you may find more practical or useful for your materials. And there are a lot of specific guides and tutorials to writing finding aids, including a great free course from the Society of American Archivists. And we've collected a bunch of these resources and we'll provide links to them. But what I want to do today is discuss why and how we use different standards for finding aids at a more sort of foundational, less technical level. Next slide, please. So I think I actually already used this word. Finding aids are a surrogate for the actual archival materials. They stand in for the archival materials for a person to review. A digitized version is also a surrogate. An inventory is a surrogate. It's whatever someone might be using to interface as an interface between themselves and the actual materials. That's why a lot of finding aids are called guide to the such and such papers, because they are providing a sort of summary and a bit of context. The first finding aids were in print and then became electronic documents. So you might have something that's written on a typewriter, something that is a Word document or a PDF. And then, in 1983, the SAA published a standard called Archives, Personal Papers, and Manuscripts, but that has since been superseded. So a finding aid might be online as files attached to a catalog record or just formatted as a web page in HTML according to a descriptive standard, but that's not the same thing as encoded archival description, and it doesn't have to be. Archivists do a ton of research to understand and correctly label their collections, and finding aids preserve all that research and then make it useful for the next people to use that collection. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a standard that came out in the 80s, but by the end of the 20th century, there were separate American and Canadian standards for finding aids. And to be honest, there probably was something different going on in Europe too. So describing archives, a content standard, which I think is a very funny title, like a content standard as the subtitle, was developed at the beginning of the 2000s, was published in 2004 and adopted as a standard by SAA in 2005. There were major revisions in 2013 and 2022, and it's on a continuous revision cycle to keep it in line with other descriptive practices and to keep up with thought in the field. It relies on and works in concert with other descriptive standards, the International Standard Archival Description General, which is ISADG, and the International Standard Archival Authority Record for Corporate Bodies, Persons, and Families, which is ISAR CPF. So I used to explain to history students when I was working in higher education that finding aids are longer and more complicated than catalog records for books, because books have relatively consistent formats, but archival collections do not. So having a standard is for describing archival materials is different than how to, say, write a MARC record, because the materials are all so different, but the standard allows us to approach the materials in the same way. Next slide, please. So DACS is a standard not only for what information should be in a finding aid, but how we should format it and what sources are acceptable for that information. So how do you decide what you call someone? who's the creator of the collection, what format of the name. Oh, sorry, there's a question in the chat. What is a MARC record? Sorry. So that is, so it's MARC for machine readable cataloging. That is the format for cataloging books in a library catalog. So I think that was developed in like the 1960s. So I think it was developed on punch cards. But when book catalogers are describing book, just an individual book, and whether that description ends up in a card catalog or on an online catalog, they're using what's called MARC. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. So in thinking about the acceptable sources for information, other descriptive standards will talk about, like, how do you decide what's the subtitle for a book? Where on the copyright page can you find particular pieces of information? It's the same with archival materials. So DACS standardizes, like I said, the approach to the description of the archives, and also standardizes the type of information. So like we always include a biographical or historical note, a scope and content note, which kind of defines the types of materials that are in the collection. We'll get more into the details a few slides ahead. But DACS also defines what minimal information is required for a finding aid to represent that archival collection, and what other information is an added value. So, for example, if you've got a ton of finding aids and you are not going to be able to process them in a really detailed way, DACS sets out what are the most important things that you need to capture? What information is the core of the finding aid? Everything else you add, maybe you do it later, maybe you don't do it at all, but you can still write a DACS compliant finding aid using a smaller subset of information. And it allows archivists to prioritize the types of description that they're doing and what information would be the most important to provide access to users. And that's certainly vital in this age of ever increasing archival collections and ever increasing archival collections backlogs. So archivists need to work quickly and need to be able to identify the most important things that need to go into the finding aid. Next slide, please. So DACS has chapters on the following elements: the identity, what is this thing, who's responsible for it, what is its collection number, the content and structure. So I mentioned a scope and content note earlier. So that's what the way I like to describe that is it's this person's papers. This collection includes their personal correspondence, but not stuff related to their political campaigns, for example. Rules about access. So are there particular technological requirements for accessing these materials? Are there donor imposed restrictions on, some materials are not accessible for 50 years? Acquisition and appraisal. So appraisal isn't financial appraisal, it's the appraisal of the research value of the materials and also where they came from. Related materials, either in your collection or in other collections, which is great. Like if you ever wanted to look at the papers of John Keats, they're in 47 different libraries. So a finding aid can capture where there are like materials. Various other types of notes. And then the descriptive control. So that's what, if you're using a controlled vocabulary, like the Library of Congress subject headings or other controlled vocabularies, and finding standardized forms of people's names, things like that. That's descriptive control. So next slide, please. So some types of information that you're going to find in the, as described in those various chapters: the title, the creators, the dates of the materials, scope and content, what's here and what isn't. So, maybe someone's doing research on a particular aspect of a person's life or a particular time period in an organizational history. They'll be able to tell if from a finding aid, does this collection have the scope that's relevant to their research? The processing information, which will describe, who processed it, did they impose a new order, or is this, the papers were received like this and they are in folders basically as the donor and the creator of the materials had them organized, or was it a desk drawer dumped into a box and the archivist had to impose order on it? acquisition info and provenance information, which will tell you, was it a gift? Was it a purchase? When did that happen? That helps to establish the legitimacy and also just the history of and heritage of these particular materials. A biographical or historical note, which explains the key people in the collection or organizations or events that it's important for someone to understand in order to navigate these materials, how they are arranged. So particular series, like there's a series for correspondence, or there's a series for each person in this family. Updates or revisions to the finding aid that correct or add new information, or if there are new accruals of materials. So we processed this whole collection, but 3 years later, we got more of it. And then finally, the inventory of what is actually in the collection. And that can be processed to just the box level. Like here, there are 6 boxes roughly related to these things, to the folder level. So here's each folder in the collection, or even down to the item level. So every single letter or photograph in the collection is listed. So those are all options. Next slide, please. So then, if we're capturing all this information according to DACS, what is EAD? So EAD was actually developed around the same time as DACS, which was actually a surprise to me when I learned it. So it's an XML-based strategy for structuring this human-readable information that's in a finding aid, that's all text, into a format that a computer can parse. So if you've ever worked in HTML to write a web page, then XML tags will look a bit familiar. Some archive databases structure collections in a way that it can be exported to EAD. So like if you're using archive space, for example, and you've got your inventory and all of your notes written in there, you can export all of that into EAD code. And then the EAD can then be hosted online. So why would we bother using it? The structured machine readable part of EAD allows a computer to understand, lots of air quotes, the information so that it can be aggregated or exported. So the example, I think easier examples to think about are, so if you have a citation manager like Zotero or RefWorks, and where it's just got a button that you click in your browser and it grabs all the information about the website or the article or the book. The reason it is able to parse that into author, title, URL, dates is because the information is structured. Like this is the title, this is the creator. Or similarly, like if you use Pinterest and you just click the button on your browser to capture something, structured information is what tells Pinterest what title information to grab and which images to grab. So obviously finding is a lot longer than either of those things, but hopefully those are good analogies. And when you're editing the XML, you can use any text editor like Notepad or Notepad Pro. There's Notepad++, there's Oxygen, there's Dreamweaver. Those are all options, and you are encoding the information with the goal of putting it online. Next slide, please. So DACS and EAD are partners in representing the same metadata. You probably wouldn't be just using EAD on its own, because EAD doesn't necessarily dictate where the information needs to come from, what information needs to be in the finding aid. It's just telling you how to organize it and how to, this goes in this field, this goes in this field. But you would be structuring a DACS compliant finding aid in EAD or developing the two documents in tandem. DACS specifies what EAD elements and also what mark fields if you're also putting your archival collection in a library catalog, crosswalk to different parts of a finding aid. So an EAD finding aid will have in what's called an encoding analog, to say like the one, this is the 100 field of a mark record. And so they can talk to each other. I might be getting a little bit into the weeds, but DACS and EAD are not opposing they're not opposing standards. They work together to represent the same information in different ways. Next slide, please. So EAD groups the parts of the finding aid as described by DACS into conceptual sections. For example, all the bibliographic and administrative information, like the collection numbers, the declarations of what languages are present, the publication of the finding aid by the repository, all that goes into a field which has two different names, depending on which version of the EAD standard you're using. It's usually going to be called control or EAD header. That's because the original EAD in 2002 has since evolved. There are some new standards. You can still use EAD 2002. The archival description or the ArcDesc, I realize that sometimes I just say the name of the tag, but this section will contain all the notes about access, the scope of content, and it will also contain the inventory information. So it's set up hierarchically, which if you've ever worked in HTML will probably be familiar. So the tags sort of nest. So at the beginning and end, you have it's an XML declaration, and then you close out that it's an XML declaration. And then as you nest and get closer to the center, you get more and more specific bits of information. So there's lots of information within the archival description field. New slide, please. Next slide. The descriptive identification field, or the DID, maintains all of the inventory elements of the archival collection. So that goes inside the archival description field because it is part of that. And then the C, or container, is a conceptual or physical entity of archival materials. So it can be something kind of conceptual, like a series, or it can be a folder or an item number, or a representation of a digital object. And so those will be they will go in the inventory. Next slide, please. So again, like I said, the reason you would use EAD is to represent your archival information on the internet, which is great for allowing for links to digital content, sources, bibliographies, or related materials. And you might be putting your EAD finding aids into, like, on your own library's website, or contributing them to a regional finding aid repository. So like my state has one. There's Digital Commonwealth. Actually, I'm not sure if Digital Commonwealth in Massachusetts does finding aids, but there are lots of different regional aggregators. And there are also, there's also an effort, I had a meeting about it this morning, about archivists are trying to build a national finding aid network. So if you want to represent your materials in EAD finding aids and you want to have them online, but you don't necessarily have the capacity or the IT infrastructure to make that happen, the idea is you would be able to contribute your finding aids to one big pot of finding aids that people could search. So it would be akin to WorldCat for books. You can get on WorldCat, and it's an aggregator of many library collections. So you can figure out, where can I interlibrary loan this book from? Obviously, you can't interlibrary loan an archival collection, but the end goal would be, I'm looking for papers on this particular person, and you can search the National Finding Aid Network and see, I need to talk to these 3 archives. Maybe they're all in one place, maybe they're in different places. But the idea is that researchers would be able to figure out where there are materials that are relevant to their research. So Europe actually has something that is the template for what we want to happen here. It's Archives Portal Europe. I think it's just archivesportaleurope.net, something like that. I actually just learned about that this morning. So yes, that was everything I wanted to say for this slide. Sorry. Next slide, please. So what about all these other metadata standards? DUBLIN Core, RDA, there are all of these other standards that like I've presented on that you may have encountered in your work. So like DUBLIN Core actually did a presentation on this 2 months ago, named after the city of Dublin, Ohio, not Dublin, Ireland. Allows for the description of any type of object, a chair, a book, a photograph, a whole archival collection. And you could represent information about an archival collection with Dublin Core, but it wouldn't be as detailed or as contextual. And Dublin Core is better used for describing individual items, like individual photos, individual objects, whatever. And because Dublin Core is designed to be so broad-based, you're not going to get that same detailed granular information that DACS and EAD allow you to represent. DACS does work in concert with RDA, which is resource description and access that's used by library catalogers. So it works in tandem with that, as well as the other international standards that I mentioned. So next slide, please. Oh, wait, is that the next slide? We had one about alternatives.
There we go.
There we go. I was like, we ran through this. Where did it go? There is a question in the archival community, like, well, these are really complicated documents. They're very time consuming to write. And are they useful to researchers, or are we kind of writing them all for each other as archivists? And I think it's definitely a valid question. You know, a DACS finding aid is not the only way to represent information. And it's okay if your community or your collections are better served by an alternate form of metadata or guiding information. You know, if you've got a whole photo collection digitized and online, and that's working, do you necessarily also need to write a finding aid for it? And I think depending on your staff capacity and the time that you have, I think it's totally valid to skip writing the finding aid and present the information in a different way. I mean, still just having your digital file hierarchies, if it's digital information, or other types of inventories like a box folder list, that's still incredibly useful. Like if you've got a website that you've hand coded, or it's on, you know, WordPress or something, and you have a list of what your collections are, and you've got links out just to a box inventory, that's way more accessible than nothing. So if writing a DACS compliant EAD encoded finding aid is not realistic, then like, don't feel bad. You know, finding aid is one tool. And I think that as archivists, we can get a little bit too excited about it. It's a great tool, but it's not the only tool for making materials accessible. And, you know, and maybe your community would rather you spend your time fully digitizing the collection rather than providing all this contextual metadata, especially if you're in a community archives where, you know, the people using the collection are going to know a lot of that context already. And maybe you're capturing that in different ways, like oral histories or everyone is working together to write image descriptions, something like that. Like, why write a finding aid if you don't have to? So even though I have spent the last half an hour talking about these standards, I also don't want this to feel like I'm presenting an obstacle. These are the things that you must do with your archives. So I believe that's the last slide, and I will take questions now. Thank you for listening.
Oh. Yeah, so we'll do questions in 1 second. If you go to that URL, we've got some links that Jen has provided. One's to like a free mini course on, is it on EAD?
There are a couple. So there's, if you are an SAA member, there is a free course on DACS. I think there's also, there are videos on EAD. Yeah, SAA, sorry. SAA also has free primers or primers. I never say the word the same way as other people, just on YouTube. And there are some guides to what is a finding aid, some online classes. There's an amazing resource called EA Diva, which was written by Ruth Kitchen Tillman. She made an entire website defining every single EAD tag and how you would use it and providing examples. And it's such a gift to the cultural heritage community. Yeah. So those are some of the types of links that are going to be up there.
Yeah, so if you click on that, there's like a list of links to take a look at. Next Monday, we're doing a webinar on military genealogy, going over different US conflicts, what records exist for them. So if you guys also do some family genealogy, you might want to check that out. And then the next webinar that Jen is doing is on deciphering handwriting in print. And I think this kind of would help everybody, archivists and genealogists.
Yeah, and so I want to talk about handwriting trends through history and how it's varied over time in different styles of handwriting, and talk a bit about writing technology and how that affects what our handwriting looks like. And just give some basic strategies for gleaning what a sentence means in modes of writing that are not familiar to us. I think if you look at styles of writing, especially professional writing in newspapers from 200 years ago, you'd be like, this sentence is incredibly long. What's happening? And so just our modes of expression are very different over time. So I want to talk a little bit about actually making sense of the words once you figure out what the words are, but also figuring out what the words are.
Yep. And then we've got another webinar with Jenna in June. And we talk a little bit about this one.
So I want to talk about how throughout history, language has been weaponized to marginalize people and classify them and treat them as other. And when we do archival descriptive work, we have an opportunity to recognize the dignity in people in the past, and we can describe with care in choosing the language that we use, and by reframing historical language that's considered harmful. So I want to just have a general introduction to some standards that are out there for how to approach that. If you heard a bang, that might have been the cat. How to approach more empathetic description, and how we can bring a level of care to our work as archivists and memory workers.
All right, thank you for listening to our plugs for our June webinars. Again, our website is backlog-archivist.com, and my email is right there. And now we will take questions. Feel free to just unmute yourself and say something, or throw it in the chat.
Well, I have a question, several. When you gave the description of Mark, and I know this was a long time back in your presentation, is the R for records or research or what in Mark?
I think it's readable. It's like, it's not an exact acronym. It's like the MA is for machine.
Yeah. Oh, MA is for machine, not machine archiving.
Right. Yeah, because so it was designed specifically for books. So, but you can also use it to capture archival information, but it was designed for books, and it's an old like punch card. That's how it started. And it has just evolved as computers have evolved. So it's just how would you take any bibliographic information and make it machine readable? Yes, okay, much better definitions in the chat. MARC is the acronym for Machine Readable Cataloging. It defines a data format that emerged from a Library of Congress-led initiative that began nearly 40 years ago. And you said you had a couple questions?
Yes. I've been working at this a long time, but I'm still a novice. And I started a nonprofit in this in Weston, Missouri, which is a Civil War town that's thriving. It's a historical town that has lots of tourism, but they've been lacking their Black history, and so that's where I come in. And so I'm trying to develop a Black history archive, and that's a big job.
Yeah.
And I feel disorganized, and that's why I'm taking these courses or your talks to try to figure out how to start and how to not repeat work that I've done, so that I can put my hands on it quickly.
Yeah.
When I'm
Are you still developing? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to be able to find it fast when I'm trying to, develop my. And we've got a lot of digitizations to do and a whole lot of things to do. And I'm kind of the chief cook and bottle washer. So I'm the full volunteer force.
Yeah.
But I have some help, but I feel like I can tell that they're waning.
Yeah.
To do. So
are you still building the collection? Are you still in the building stages, or do you have a collection that you're working
Well,
on?
I've got tidbits. I've got stuff everywhere. I'm so happy you can only see this much of my office.
Same, this is my refrigerator.
Yeah.
Yeah, where
So,
I would recommend starting, and maybe you've done some of this already, is thinking about when you take a collection in, how are you going to number it? Writing a collecting policy so you can really define what it is that you're looking for and whether something fits into your scope as a collection.
mhm.
Because there might be things that come in that are related to each other, but you don't necessarily want to smush them together into one collection because they have two different sources.
Mhm.
And writing kind of a local, I don't want to say standards again, but local guidance for how you want to approach new material coming in, how you want to name your digital files. So like, for example, we have a standard at my workplace that's like everything includes the collection number and a sequential number. And I had another thought and it completely just left my brain.
And Angela, we can reach out to you later. We're doing free mini archival assessments, and that could really
Okay.
help you
Okay.
set some
And
goals.
how to cross-reference and things, just like what you were saying. This may go with that, but it also goes here, but it
Mhm.
doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I mean, the way I approach archival materials, so I work for a series of historic houses, and in the past, everything related to one house or one family was all pulled together from different sources, but that means you don't know where any of it came from. So I take the approach, which is also partially like the principle of original order, that it's better to have a bunch of smaller collections where it's like all of these materials are definitely related to each other in their own history, like not just what their content is, but like they all came from the same person,
Mhm.
or this, the same attic. But once they're all described, then you might be able to search and say, this is everything related to people who lived on this street, or this particular event. And it's a bunch of different collections. So you don't have to worry about like, well, where do I put it in this collection or this collection? It's its own collection. And then you just have it described so that you can search all of the different descriptions.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If I didn't have video on, I don't know if anyone would understand because I have to gesture.
Well, we're part of the museum. It's a nonprofit, and so that's helpful, but it's still daunting, but I haven't given up yet. So
Yeah, don't give up. It's all doable.
yeah.
So
Okay.
we've got a couple of other questions. One is about, yes, we're recording this webinar. It will be on YouTube. You can follow us on YouTube. It's Backlog Archivists. I will also email it to everybody who registered and is on this call.
And there's a question about templates for a small genealogical society to use. I know that there are templates out there. I'm not sure if you mean specifically for DACS or for EAD, but I know in the resources that are on the Backlog website, you can see the full DACS standard. I mean, you can buy it as a book, but it's also entirely for free online. And looking at EA Diva, she has complete examples of code. So if you have all the information that like the collection is processed and you just want to hand write the code, you can do that. Or if you're using any sort of archival management system like ArchiveSpace, look into what your options are for exporting that straight into EAD code. But I also know a lot of people also aren't using archives specific collection management systems. Have you utilized Dublin Core for a starting guide for organizing and describing the archives? I usually use Dublin Core for describing particular like photographs that are going to go online. If I have a bunch of papers, I don't use Dublin Core. I'll write a finding aid. You could use Dublin Core if how about this? So I think you would have to think about what is your end goal for how you want to present your metadata. Are you going to be having it online? Is it going to be printed out for people to access in person? And also how much time do you want to spend on it? So you could, like, just on your website, have things organized into Dublin Core fields, just have like a web page for each collection or something like that. But I usually use Dublin Core if I'm like digitizing a big collection and it's going into a digital asset management system, or it's going into our online photo library, or if you're contributing to something like DPLA, or the Digital Public Library of America, or if you're contributing to JSTOR or ArtStore, one of those big image and primary source libraries, that's usually when I would use something like Dublin Core.
Yeah, and we did a webinar on Dublin Core and how Dublin Core can be used in Omeka, and Omeka is kind of a digital like exhibit platform. And so Dublin Core is really for items, especially like digital items. And then whereas Finding Aid would be information about a whole collection. So it's kind of different levels of description. Yeah, and
thank you for clarifying. I typed it because I was at a stoplight and I wasn't sure how much background noise I would get if I would talk. So, but we are using Omeka though.
Okay, well, be careful. Not with Omeka, but driving.
Yeah, and
you don't know if I'm driving.
It's not super dangerous.
Yeah. And there are a lot of different standards like floating around, and it's just figuring out what's suitable for what. And sometimes that can be hard, especially if you're just starting out. Yeah.
Any other questions? I have fully explained everything about finding aids. This is it.
Yeah. Okay. I will send out a link to this recording tomorrow to everybody. And Angela, I will reach out to you so we can discuss your archive a little bit more. But thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to Jenna for giving us this tutorial.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
A lot of it went over my head, but I'll be happy to get the link or the recording of it. So.
Yeah, I know I talk really fast, so everybody can slow it down.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.